Developed nations and developed economies sometimes, or actually often, plead with African nations to invest in the kind of ambitious resilience project that the international community need to survive in a warming world. But in my opinion, what's lacking from this conversation is to talk about access to finance, access to climate finance. Because one of the key aspects of the issue is that in Africa, we cannot fix the climate issue unless we fix the question of access to finance. In my previous episode, I actually laid the foundation for understanding the strong link between the debt crisis and climate solution. Welcome to Smart, Intellectual, Knowledgeable African. I'm S.I.K.A. Before I continue discussing this very interesting topic, let me invite you to click on the subscribe button if you're not a member of this community, and to also activate the ring bell so that you do not miss out on the very interesting upcoming episodes. Well, it is now time to understand the Africa debt crisis, to actually give some figures. And according to the latest figures, Africa's debt repayment will surge to 62 billion this year in 2023, which is actually 35% more from what was recorded in 2022. $62 billion in terms of debt repayment. And to put this figure into context, it is very interesting to understand and to also know that the continent is paying more in debt service than the estimated 50 billion a year, that is usually expected from a continent. Which means that first, the African continent is over indebted. But second, in terms of debt servicing, which actually equates to debt repayment, the continent is paying actually more than the international cap, because of course, there are actually no government, there are no countries in the world, that is not in debt. But the problem with the African continent, or the problem with the African situation, is that the level of the debt is becoming, too much. It's becoming too critical. We need to actually think of new ways, to actually reduce the amount of the debt, the level of the debt, and the amount of the debt servicing. But unfortunately, as it stands, the African continent is paying already too much, but is already paying beyond the international cap, which is estimated at actually 50 billion. But in 2023, the African nations have actually reached a level where they have repaid, or they are currently repaying almost $62 billion. You see, this is very, very high. And why this is very high? Because in addition to repaying, this international debt, African nations also have to invest money into creating, into adapting, into fighting, into mitigating the climate change threats, for the continent, for the people, for their economy, which again necessitates additional fund that they do not have, since they are actually allocating a huge portion of their public resources towards repaying already existing international debt. But the fight against climate change, or the solutions for climate change, like I said in the previous episode, are actually investments that are not nice to have. There are actually critical and necessary investment. They are vital for building roads, for instance, building bridges, dams that can actually withstand torrential rains and floods. And you will definitely agree with me that failure to do so is to invite catastrophe, as we've seen recently in Libya. So, what are the solutions that we can actually recommend, or that we can actually, suggest to make sure that while the continent, is facing the current debt crisis, how is he also going to be able to cope with the level of investment needed towards climate solution? Well, there are actually various levels and various, recommendations made by international, organization, African leaders. And one solution that I can actually think of is called the Bridgetown Initiative, which is actually co-started by Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados. This initiative actually puts forward measures, to channel more credit and investment into climate resilience, and to also lay down rules for providing debt relief for climate vulnerable solutions. So in a nutshell, what the Bridgetown Initiative is trying to create is a context or a scenario where, given the fact that your country is first identified as a developing or as a poor nation, and second is already or also identified as a climate vulnerable nation, you will therefore qualify for, a debt relief over, a specific period of time, which instead will help you, channel all the existing budget into creating, developing, and accessing, the latest technologies available to make sure that you can face up to whatever climate threat your economy and your country, might actually face off. Another solution is a 10-year moratorium on interest payment on foreign debt to give the world's most vulnerable countries the space to invest in climate resilience and other pressing needs, like health and education, And the 10-year moratorium is somehow similar to a debt relief. The moratorium for 10 years simply means that your country will now be given, or will actually now be afforded, the possibility to actually put a hold on the debt repayment while focusing on investing in other sectors like health, education, agriculture. So in the longer run, you are actually fostering economic progress and economic development into these traditional areas, which in turn, which when the time is right, will help you, access additional funds so that you can resume, repaying your initial debt. And, these solutions are very original, but these solutions are also very rational. In my opinion, they are very rational because we should never forget that the situation that we are talking about is not a situation that is 100% or majoritarily, coming from the African nations or developing nations. We need to situate actually, responsibility and allocate responsibilities across countries. And we also need to make sure that in the conversation around climate solution, we do not forget the financial burden that is actually, unevenly spread across nations. Another solution that, the international community is suggesting, and I'm not going to say the international community, but I will actually say some African leaders, such as, the current president of Kenya, the Republic of Kenya, the president of the African Development Bank, the president of the African Union Commission, it is to also, add more flexibility into the global financial system. Debt repayment, for example, should be suspended automatically, like when climate disaster strike. Meaning that in situation where your country is unexpectedly hit by a climate disaster, like the one we saw in Libya recently, whatever foreign debt that you are busy repaying should be put on hold. So what the international community or what the proponent, of Africa financial independence are actually saying is that we do not ask for our debt to be written off, but what we are asking is for a more logical, system, a more rational system that also considers the current economic state of our nations, that also considers the current challenges and threat of our nation at a given time for a specific period. Well, these are already existing solutions from, high-level senior that are currently lobbying and advocating, before the international community so that we come to an arrangement, to an agreement when it comes to helping the African continent fixing its crisis, its debt crisis towards, helping him finding, an adequate level of financial solution towards climate change. But in my opinion, these solutions are very interesting. But there is another way that is missing from the equation. And this is my personal analysis, this is my personal input. What I don't like with this solution is the fact that they tend to actually advocate for more credit. And don't get me wrong, credit is not bad. Credit is actually a tool at your disposal. May you be an individual or a nation, credit is a tool at your disposal to actually maximize in terms of time, but also maximize in terms of access to financial resources. But my problem with the kind of solution that they are actually recommending is that I do not see any element, I do not see any part where the responsibility is also shift, from the international community to the African community, to actually African nations. What I'm trying to say here is that in an environment or in a system where everything is already rigged against you, and a system where you do not have much leverage to actually challenge the status quo, to actually make sure that whatever access to finance or access to capital, is actually completed at a very reasonable, level of interest rate, you should actually put yourself in a situation where whatever money, you are gaining or you are getting from international financial institution is actually well spent. My problem here is that, well, access to money is costly for African nations. That's the first challenge. But the second challenge is that we have a real issue of transparency. We have a real issue of appropriate and adequate management of public resources, which in turn has actually a detrimental effect on the economic development of African nations. Well, government has to borrow money. There is actually no government in the world which has never borrowed money from international institutions, from the capital market, or from other countries. If you take the United States of America, it is the most indebted nation in the world. Their current debt is actually over $20 trillion, but still they continue accessing loan, they continue accessing credit at a cheaper rate than the African continent, at a cheaper rate than many African nations. Why is that? Well, I'm not gonna actually get into too much detail, otherwise this episode is going to be very lengthy. But my point here is that in addition to all the solutions, that I just discussed, we should also consider an aspect where, we also recommend, African leaders, African head of nations, African government to actually make sure that whatever credit they access, they make sure that the fund is actually well managed with transparency. The money is actually allocated to the right economic sectors in order for it to actually create and produce, larger scale benefit for the population, and also empowering, local community to make sure that they can, create wealth. They can also create businesses, which in turn are going to improve on the credit score for, the continent and of the country. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I hope you found this episode very enlightening as usual. Thank you for taking the time to listening to S.I.K.A Talks, the podcast where strong realities meet powerful perspectives. À bientôt.